Abundance cannot attach to a fragmented self because abundance is not an object that can be held by force, desire, or effort alone. It is a state that requires internal coherence. When the inner world is divided into competing parts, one part striving forward, another pulling backward, another doubting the right to receive, abundance has no stable ground on which to settle. It may appear briefly, almost teasingly, but it cannot remain where there is no unity of direction. A fragmented self lives in contradiction. One voice says, "I want more," while another whispers, "More will cost you something you cannot afford to lose." This inner conflict is not loud or obvious. It disguises itself as caution, humility, or realism. Yet beneath these masks is a deeper fear that expansion will expose unresolved wounds, unintegrated emotions, and hidden beliefs. Abundance amplifies the psyche, and amplification is terrifying to a mind that has learned to survive by staying small. Fragmentation often forms early, long before conscious ambition emerges. It begins when certain traits are rewarded while others are rejected. Confidence may have been punished, sensitivity mocked, anger forbidden, desire shamed. To adapt, the psyche splits. One part becomes acceptable, functional, presentable. Another is buried, denied, or exiled. Over time, this division feels normal. The individual no longer experiences it as fragmentation, but as just the way I am. Abundance challenges this internal arrangement. When opportunity appears, the suppressed parts awaken. Confidence triggers guilt. Visibility activates fear. Power resurrects memories of punishment. The mind, seeking equilibrium, unconsciously restores the old balance by sabotaging the new condition. Decisions are delayed. Risks are avoided. Momentum dissolves. Abundance retreats, not because it was undeserved, but because the inner system rejected the tension it created. A fragmented self also struggles with consistency. Different parts take control at different times. One day there is clarity, discipline, and conviction. The next, hesitation, self-doubt, and withdrawal. From the outside, this looks like a lack of commitment or follow-through. Internally, it is a rotation of inner authorities, each with its own agenda. Abundance requires a unified command structure. Without it, progress cannot stabilize. There is also the issue of identity. A fragmented self does not know who it is when circumstances change. If identity was formed in scarcity, struggle, or invisibility, abundance threatens to dissolve the familiar self-image. The psyche often prefers a painful identity over an unfamiliar one. Pain is known. Expansion is not. To protect identity, the mind unconsciously engineers a return to the old environment where the self-concept still makes sense. Fragmentation creates emotional leakage. Energy is consumed managing inner conflict rather than building external reality. One part pushes forward, another resists, a third rationalizes inaction. This constant negotiation drains vitality. Abundance requires surplus energy, not just in action, but in attention and emotional availability. When energy is scattered across unresolved inner battles, there is nothing left to sustain growth. Another consequence of fragmentation is distorted self-trust. If different parts repeatedly override one another, the individual learns not to trust their own decisions. Confidence becomes fragile, dependent on mood or external reassurance. Abundance, however, responds to self-trust. It stabilizes where decisions are made and upheld, where direction is maintained despite internal discomfort. A fragmented self cannot provide this reliability. Integration is not about eliminating parts of the self, but about bringing them into conscious relationship. When the rejected aspects are acknowledged rather than suppressed, the inner world becomes less hostile. Fear is no longer working in secret. Desire no longer needs to hide. Power no longer feels forbidden. With integration, the psyche stops pulling itself apart to maintain equilibrium. As integration increases, inner contradictions soften. The self no longer needs to sabotage expansion to protect buried wounds. Abundance no longer threatens internal collapse. Instead of triggering fear, growth becomes an extension of an already unified structure. The individual can tolerate success, visibility, and responsibility without losing psychological balance. Abundance attaches to coherence. It stays where intention, belief, emotion, and identity point in the same direction. Where the inner world is aligned, the outer world can stabilize. Where the self is whole, expansion no longer feels like a threat to survival, but a natural expression of internal order. Unintegrated shadow creates self-sabotage cycles, because whatever is denied consciousness does not disappear. It reorganizes itself in the dark and waits for expression. The shadow is not evil, broken, or defective. It is simply the collection of traits, impulses, emotions, and desires that were deemed unacceptable at some point and therefore pushed out of awareness. What is repressed does not lose energy, it gains autonomy. When the shadow remains unintegrated, it expresses itself indirectly. It does not announce itself clearly or rationally. Instead, it interferes. It shows up as bad luck, repeated mistakes, sudden loss of motivation, or choices that undermine long-term goals. The individual experiences this as confusion or frustration, never fully understanding why progress collapses at the same point again and again. Self-sabotage is not a lack of willpower, it is an internal conflict of authority. The conscious self sets goals aligned with social values, ambition, or survival needs. The shadow holds the rejected needs of the psyche: anger, that was forbidden; power, that felt dangerous; desire, that felt shameful; autonomy, that threatened attachment. When these two sides are not reconciled, they compete for control of behavior. The conscious mind moves towards success. The shadow pulls the system back toward familiarity. The psyche always seeks balance, not achievement. If success activates guilt, fear, or unresolved resentment, the shadow intervenes to restore psychological equilibrium. The individual then unconsciously makes choices that relieve inner tension, even if those choices damage external progress. This is why sabotage often occurs at moments of expansion. Promotions, breakthroughs, recognition, or financial growth trigger the shadow because they activate the very traits that were once suppressed. Visibility awakens fear of exposure. Authority awakens fear of punishment. Independence awakens fear of abandonment. The shadow responds by derailing the situation before these fears become conscious. The shadow also carries disarmed strengths. Assertiveness, ambition, competitiveness, and decisiveness are often buried early in life when they conflict with the need to be accepted. Later, when life demands these traits, the individual struggles to access them directly. Instead, they emerge in distorted forms: passive aggression, procrastination, sudden withdrawal, or self-criticism. The person appears to be working against themselves, but in reality they are obeying an internal rule they never consciously chose. Unintegrated shadow manifests through repetition. The same relationship patterns reappear. The same financial mistakes recur. The same emotional breakdowns follow moments of progress. Each cycle feels personal and unique, yet the structure remains identical. This repetition is not coincidence. It is the psyche attempting to resolve a conflict without conscious participation. Because the shadow is unconscious, the individual often externalizes blame. Circumstances are seen as hostile. Other people are seen as obstacles. Fate is seen as unfair. This projection protects the ego from confronting the internal source of disruption. As long as the cause is perceived as external, the cycle continues uninterrupted. Moral self-image also strengthens sabotage. When the ego identifies exclusively with being good, kind, or selfless, the shadow absorbs everything deemed selfish, aggressive, or poor-oriented. These qualities do not vanish. They become resentful. They sabotage from below, creating situations where the individual accidentally acts against their own stated values or interests, then feels shame and confusion afterward. The shadow seeks recognition, not destruction. Sabotage is a demand for inclusion. When ignored, it escalates. When partially acknowledged, it retreats temporarily. When integrated, it transforms from an enemy into a source of energy, clarity, and resilience. Integration does not mean acting out every impulse. It means recognizing the legitimacy of the underlying need. Once the shadow is consciously faced, its compulsive behavior loses force. The individual no longer needs to create failure to express suppressed emotions. Anger can be felt without explosion. Desire can be acknowledged without guilt. Power can be claimed without cruelty. The psyche no longer needs to undermine itself to maintain internal balance. Self-sabotage ends not through discipline alone, but through psychological honesty. The moment the individual stops pretending to be only what they were allowed to be, the internal war quiets. Energy previously used for interference becomes available for construction. Progress no longer feels dangerous because nothing inside is being threatened with extinction. Comfort is the enemy of permanence because comfort encourages psychological stagnation, while permanence requires continual adaptation. What feels comfortable is what is familiar, predictable, and emotionally safe. The psyche gravitates toward these states not because they are optimal, but because they reduce uncertainty. Yet anything that remains stable in the external world demands internal flexibility. Without it, stability erodes. Comfort creates the illusion of arrival. When comfort is achieved, effort relaxes, awareness dulls, and vigilance fades. The individual begins to treat a temporary condition as a permanent one. This is not arrogance, it is neurological efficiency. The mind conserves energy by repeating known patterns. But what once produced growth becomes the very pattern that prevents it. Permanence is not maintained by repeating what worked before. It is maintained by continuously responding to change. Markets shift, relationships evolve, responsibilities expand, and internal states fluctuate. Comfort resists this reality. It seeks to freeze time at a moment where effort feels minimal and reward feels sufficient. The psyche interprets this as safety, even when it is actually decay. When comfort takes priority, learning slows. Curiosity fades. The edge that once created momentum dulls. Skills are no longer sharpened, only reused. This creates vulnerability. External conditions do not need to become hostile for collapse to occur. They only need to continue changing while the individual remains static. Comfort also distorts perception. The individual begins to overestimate their stability and underestimate risk. Small warning signs are ignored because acknowledging them would disturb the comfortable narrative. Necessary discomfort is postponed. Difficult conversations are avoided. Weaknesses are rationalized rather than corrected. Over time, these ignored details accumulate until the system can no longer compensate. Psychologically, comfort reinforces identity attachment. The self becomes invested in maintaining a certain image, lifestyle, or role. Any challenge to this identity feels like a threat rather than an invitation to evolve. The individual defends the comfort zone not with logic, but with emotion. Criticism feels personal. Change feels hostile. Growth feels unnecessary. Comfort also breeds dependency on external conditions. When stability is attributed to circumstances rather than internal capability, the individual loses resilience. If comfort was created by a favorable environment, then any disruption destabilizes the self. Permanence, however, requires independence from conditions. It demands that stability come from internal structure, not external ease. There is also a moral dimension to comfort. Many confuse comfort with balance, peace, or self-care. While restoration is necessary, prolonged comfort without challenge erodes capacity. The psyche grows through tension, not ease. Without manageable stress, strength atrophies. What feels like peace slowly becomes fragility. Comfort narrows tolerance for discomfort. Small challenges begin to feel overwhelming. Effort feels heavier. Resistance feels stronger. The individual becomes less willing to endure temporary strain for long-term stability. This creates a pattern where anything that threatens comfort is avoided, even when avoidance guarantees future instability. In systems of power, comfort accelerates decline. When authority is secured, complacency replaces vigilance. Boundaries soften, standards lower. Decisions become reactive rather than intentional. Those who maintain permanence understand that comfort is a signal to re-engage, not withdraw. They treat ease as a warning, not a reward. Comfort also interferes with timing. Growth opportunities are often inconvenient, uncomfortable, and poorly aligned with the desire for ease. Comfort delays action until certainty appears, but certainty never arrives. Those who wait for comfort miss the window where permanence could have been secured through adaptation. The paradox is that true permanence creates its own discomfort. Responsibility increases, complexity grows, visibility expands. The individual must continuously update their internal framework to match external reality. Comfort resists this expansion, attempting to shrink responsibility back to manageable proportions. When this contraction occurs repeatedly, stability erodes. Permanence belongs to those who can tolerate discomfort without interpreting it as danger. They understand that unease is not a sign of failure, but a signal of alignment with reality. They do not seek suffering, but they do not flee it when it appears. Comfort, when prioritized, trains the psyche to confuse ease with safety and challenge with threat, ensuring that whatever is built will eventually collapse under the weight of its own rigidity. Identity determines retention, not desire, because desire is temporary and reactive, while identity is structural and persistent. Desire arises in response to lack, comparison, or aspiration. It is emotional and fluctuates with mood, circumstance, and imagination. Identity, however, governs behavior when motivation fades. What remains in a person's life over time is shaped less by what they want and more by who they believe themselves to be. Desire can initiate movement, but it cannot sustain consistency. A person may desire success, stability, recognition, or abundance with great intensity, yet still fail to hold any of it. This failure is not due to insufficient wanting, but due to an internal contradiction. When identity does not match the desired outcome, The psyche works to restore coherence by eliminating what feels foreign. Identity acts as an internal thermostat. It regulates what feels normal, acceptable, and familiar. When external circumstances rise above this internal setting, discomfort emerges. The individual may feel anxious, fraudulent, overwhelmed, or exposed. These emotions are signals that the current condition exceeds the identity's tolerance. The psyche then unconsciously lowers the external condition to restore equilibrium. This is why people often say they feel uncomfortable when things are going well. Success creates cognitive dissonance when it clashes with self-perception. If someone identifies as a struggler, a helper, an underdog, or a background figure, sustained success disrupts the narrative that gives their life meaning. The psyche prioritizes narrative coherence over external gain. Desire is influenced by imagination, but identity is shaped by lived experience. Identity forms through repetition what was reinforced, punished, or modeled over time. It absorbs early conclusions about worth, capability, and belonging. These conclusions become invisible rules that govern behavior. Desire may challenge these rules, but identity enforces them. Retention requires alignment between internal rules and external reality. If a person identifies as irresponsible, unstable, or undeserving, they will unconsciously behave in ways that confirm this self-image. Opportunities are mishandled, boundaries are violated, discipline collapses. Not because the person wants to fail, but because success threatens the internal order. Identity also determines tolerance for responsibility. Desire often focuses on rewards, not obligations. Identity, however, dictates whether the individual can carry the weight that comes with retention. Stability brings expectation, scrutiny, and accountability. If the identity is built around freedom without structure, or care without authority, permanence feels suffocating. There is also an emotional loyalty embedded in identity. People remain loyal to who they have been, even when that loyalty costs them growth. The identity formed in hardship often carries pride, meaning, and moral superiority. Letting go of that identity can feel like betrayal, even when it no longer serves survival. Desire alone cannot override this loyalty. Identity shapes perception of self-efficacy. When identity includes competence and agency, challenges are interpreted as problems to solve. When identity includes helplessness or chaos, the same challenges are interpreted as confirmation of limitation. Retention depends on problem-solving orientation, not emotional longing. Desire is future-oriented, but identity lives in the present. The psyche acts in accordance with what it believes is true now, not what it hopes will be true later. Without identity transformation, desire remains aspirational fantasy. The individual may achieve moments of success, but the internal framework remains unchanged, ensuring regression. Identity transformation requires repetition, not revelation. Insight alone does not alter identity. New behavior must be enacted consistently until the psyche updates its self-concept. Retention stabilizes only after identity has adjusted to accommodate the new level of reality. When identity and external conditions align, effort decreases. Stability feels natural rather than forced. The individual no longer needs to monitor or defend their success because it fits within their sense of self. Desire becomes secondary because the outcome no longer feels extraordinary. People who retain success are not more motivated, they are more aligned. Their internal image of who they are includes stability, responsibility, and authority. Because of this, they behave in ways that sustain what they have. Desire brought them to the threshold, but identity determined whether they could stay on the other side. Abundance stays only where authority has been claimed, because without authority, stability is impossible. Authority is not dominance over others, but governance of the self. It is the capacity to decide, to enforce decisions internally, and to stand behind them without fragmentation. Where authority is absent, outcomes remain temporary, borrowed, or dependent on external conditions. When authority has not been claimed, life is governed by reaction. Circumstances dictate behavior. Emotions overrule intention. Other people's expectations override personal boundaries. In such a state, abundance may arrive, but it cannot remain. It requires direction, containment, and continuity. Without an internal authority, there is no structure to hold what enters. Authority begins with ownership of choice. Many avoid this because choice implies responsibility. Responsibility removes the comfort of blame. It eliminates the illusion that outcomes are caused solely by fate, timing, or others. To claim authority is to accept that one's internal state and external results are linked. This realization is unsettling, but it is the foundation of permanence. Without authority, decisions are tentative. They are reversible, negotiated, or delayed until validation appears. This indecision creates instability. Abundance responds poorly to hesitation because hesitation signals lack of commitment. What is not defended internally will not be defended externally. Opportunities are mishandled not through malice, but through ambiguity. Authority also establishes boundaries. Without boundaries, energy leaks. Time is overgiven. Focus is diluted. Priorities are compromised. Abundance requires containment. Resources must be directed, protected, and allocated intentionally. Where boundaries are weak, abundance disperses rather than consolidates. Claimed authority transforms relationship with fear. Fear no longer vetoes action. It becomes information rather than command. In the absence of authority, fear governs behavior, limiting growth and inviting retreat at moments of pressure. Abundance amplifies fear, and without authority, amplification leads to collapse. Authority also stabilizes identity. When authority is unclaimed, the self is easily influenced by approval or disapproval. Confidence fluctuates with external feedback. Success feels conditional. With authority, identity becomes internally referenced. The individual decides who they are and acts accordingly. This consistency creates reliability, which is essential for retention. Many resist authority because they associate it with rigidity, control, or moral burden. In reality, unclaimed authority creates chaos. It invites inner conflict and external instability. Authority simplifies. It reduces internal debate by establishing clear standards. It replaces emotional impulse with intentional action. Abundance requires follow-through. Follow-through is impossible without authority. Plans without enforcement dissolve. Goals without consequences fade. Authority is what ensures that intentions survive discomfort. Without it, the psyche seeks relief rather than result. Authority also determines tolerance for responsibility. Abundance brings complexity. More resources create more decisions, more visibility, and more accountability. Without authority, this complexity overwhelms. The individual unconsciously sheds abundance to return to manageable simplicity. Authority allows complexity to be navigated rather than avoided. There is also a temporal aspect to authority. Authority commits to the future. It considers long-term consequences rather than immediate comfort. Without authority, short-term relief dominates decision-making. This prioritization erodes stability over time. Abundance requires delayed gratification and sustained effort, both of which depend on internal governance. Claiming authority also ends the need for permission. Permission, seeking fragments action. It delays decisions and weakens resolve. Abundance stabilizes where action is decisive and self-sanctioned. Authority removes the dependency on external approval that undermines consistency. Authority does not eliminate uncertainty. It eliminates paralysis. The individual acts despite incomplete information, adjusts when necessary, and maintains direction. This adaptability within structure is what allows abundance to remain. Where authority is absent, abundance feels intrusive. Where authority is present, abundance feels proportional. It matches capacity. It integrates rather than destabilizes. Authority creates the psychological container that allows expansion without collapse